So today I will talk about consumer society, why is social change so difficult? And can we change the slide? Yes. And the goal of the presentation is to understand why we consume as much as we do and how to contribute to social change. And I think these are two very important questions that very much relate to what others have said earlier in the week about a different form of activism and also about this idea of what are the alternative models related to degrowth or voluntary simplicity or other ideas. First, in the first part of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of consumption. I will be brief here, but I think it's important that we discuss also this a little bit. And before I get on the part of the impact of consumption, I wanted to say a few words about the consumer society that we live in. This consumer society in Europe appeared at the end of the Second World War. And it developed quite rapidly in this period, not only because people wanted to buy and own more objects, more goods that would facilitate their lives, but especially because there was a very strong narrative behind this idea of the consumer society. And this narrative is a narrative about equality. The idea behind consumption, and in particular mass consumption, as it began and as we know it today, is that everyone would be able to have a car, a fridge, a dishwasher, a washing machine, all sorts of utilities that would facilitate their daily life. And this idea of equality is that these would no longer be luxury products that only very wealthy families could afford to have, but just that everyone could have and benefit from. And there's another side to this equality story of the consumer society, is this idea that as you consume good, you also contribute to developing work and working opportunities, for workers who are building these goods that you are consuming. So I think this is a very important, because this narrative about equality is very strong in the idea of a consumer society. And there are very interesting historical works about this that you can read and that we can talk about at the end if you're interested in this idea. About the impact. So the first impact, because I just mentioned this idea of this important narrative of equality, is how did this consumer society fare in terms of inequalities? So I want to briefly talk about the social impact. And many people know it because he became very famous for his work on inequalities. Thomas Piketty has developed this long-term data to analyze inequalities over time in Europe, but also in the US and in different parts of the world. And what I want to show you with this graph represents the private wealth to national income ratios in Europe over a long period of time. This is why I chose this graph, from 1870 to 2010. And what we see is the ratio was very high in the early period. This means that there was much more wealth in the hands of private individuals than in the hands of the state, available for public spending, for schools, hospitals, redistribution, anything. This is why it's important to think about this ratio. And then we see that in the early 20th century, the ratio goes down. So it means that we move towards more equality. And it is at its lowest in 1950, 1970. So in this early period of this consumer society, inequalities are very low. But then from the 90s especially, they start to rise again. And there are different ways. You can look at these rising inequalities. You can look at the share of top incomes, how incomes at the bottom of the income distribution grow. But still the idea is this, that there is a stronger concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer individuals. And this is interesting to put in parallel with the strong narrative of the consumer society that consuming goods and services contributes to creating this more equal society. Then another aspect that I want to briefly mention is the impact of this consumer society on well-being. So as I mentioned, the consumption of these goods, so having a dishwasher, having a washing machine, having many other facilities that would facilitate daily household chores, mostly carried by women, but still essential for our everyday life, would contribute to our well-being. And also the fact of having more working opportunities for workers, and income would rise, and it would contribute to overall well-being. And here, what I present is this graph that presents the Easterling paradox. And what you see here is the dark line is for happiness, and at the aggregate level for the United States during a period from the 70s until the early 2000s. And you see that aggregate levels of happiness are basically flat in the US. And this would be the case for most advanced economies. Whereas real income, the dashed line, increases. So as income increase, as per capita income increases, there is no substantial increase in the overall level of happiness. And this is because happiness will grow with income more in poor countries. As you get out of poverty, income and growth will contribute to happiness and well-being, because it would contribute to being able to pay for housing, to have access to health, to have access to good food. So it would make a strong contribution to well-being. But in advanced democracies as we are, increases in income do not contribute as much to increasing well-being. And the last impact that I wanted to mention is the environmental impact. And I find this date very striking. In Switzerland, so a very wealthy European country, the day of overshoot is May 11th this year. So this means that after 4 months, we already spent all the resources that are available to us if we want to live in a way that allows us to leave sufficient resources for people living in other places around the world, but also for future generations. And I find this a number very striking, because this means that after only 4 months in the year, we already used all the resources that we should be using in a whole year. So this gives an impression of the magnitude of the kind of change that we need to engage in if we want to move towards sustainable societies. And I thought it's very important to mention it also as one of the impact of consumption. So we have seen very rapidly the impact of consumption on inequalities, on well-being, and on the environment. So given this poor credential of consumption, the question is, so why? Why do we consume so much? Why do we consume as much as we do? And I want to build here on research in sociology to understand what are the social determinants of consumption and why it's so difficult to change also. Something that was mentioned earlier in the week is this idea of needs being a central element to understand consumption and to understand our lifestyles. And what is important to note is that buying, having, or even using are not the main drivers of consumption. What is driving consumption is the willingness to satisfy socially constructed needs. And here, what is very important is this idea that needs are socially constructed. Even basic needs such as food or housing are socially constructed. And what I mean by this is that in different time periods, people will have different needs. So for instance, if we take our society today in terms of food, it feels very normal to consume exotic fruit on a regular basis, even oranges, bananas, or pineapples, fruit coming from very far away, seem normal and something that you could do almost on a daily basis. This was not the case even 50 years ago. So this means, this shows that it is socially constructed. The same goes for meat. Eating meat once a day or twice a day, which is still a very common practice in our society, is something considered normal by many people today, which was not the case 50 years ago and could be very different in 50 years from now if narratives about food consumption and what is considered healthy, good, normal eating changes. And the same for housing. The size of the houses, the apartments that we live in depend on the place and time where we live. In Switzerland today, it's considered normal to have quite a big flat with one room for every inhabitant and even one more room or a few more rooms to have other spaces that you can use as offices or other things. But this is not something that today we consider as normal is also socially constructed, because if you live today in New York or Tokyo, you will live in a much smaller flat and this will appear as normal. Or if you think about Switzerland 50 years ago, people would also live in much smaller apartments or have less space for them. So this is really important to understand that there are basic needs that are universal, but often or always these basic needs are socially constructed, and people build their expectations about how to fulfill these needs on this social construction. And then lastly, it's the idea that consumption is linked to social expectations, social practices, and social identities. And in the next slides, I will develop a little bit what I mean by these three concepts. So first, regarding social expectations, I wanted to take the example of advertisement. Advertisement is all around us. It penetrates our daily lives and gives us messages about this normality, what is normal, what we should be dreaming of, what we should be expecting. And here I present a picture that I took in the metro of Zalando, which is a brand that sells clothing through internet. And you see that their slogan is free to be. So there is this idea of freedom, of being oneself, of expressing oneself. And then if you look at the image, you see that there are young people, cool, there is social diversity. So something that is rather attractive, that you want to be part of, but also something that creates expectations towards the way you should look and the kind of clothing that you should be wearing in this case. But then if you look around you, you can find many, many examples of these social expectations that are presented in advertisement. There were a few very interesting advertisements in Switzerland a few years ago from a shop, a very large retail store. And one was a mother taking care of her baby. And the slogan was saying, having time to take care for the people you love. And then they were saying, then you should buy these ready-made meals so you will have more time to spend with your children. So it appeals to very important notions of love and caring and how to do that in a society where we have very little time. And they had similar images about buying this packaged salad to have time to do yoga or other activities. So they are also very good at creating social expectation in relation to activities that are timely and trendy in society at a given time. And people feel compelled to live up to these models. Then there is the idea of social practices. And here I show a picture of a street in Geneva from Jean-Marc Meunier. And I wanted to present this picture because it helps us think about how social practices are related to the built environment in which we live. And if you think about most cities in Europe, these cities are very much constructed around consumption. In particular, the downtown areas of our cities are often places dedicated to shopping and consuming, with a multitude of stores selling just about anything, and also places where you can eat and drink and hang out if you have money to spend. But for people who don't have money to spend, the cities do not offer anything. And this is very striking if you think about young people. Often it is criticized that people hang out downtown, but they're just sitting around and wasting their time and not doing anything. But this is because the cities are built for consumption, for spending money, and social groups who do not have that kind of money to spend are left unattended in this city. They have few activities that they can do in the city center. And this is true for anyone who would like to engage in activities that are not related to consumption. The cities offer few opportunities for that in the way they are built. So this is to say that the way that our cities, our societies are organized contribute to the reproduction of specific social practices. Other examples are related to the way we eat. If you think about your workplace, is it easy to cook? Is it easy to bring your own food? Or do you have to rely on food that you buy? And similarly, when you want to go shopping after work, what are the convenient food store close to your house? And which kind of food is sold there? This all shapes the kind of social practices that you will engage in. And lastly, I wanted to say something about social identities. And this is pictures drawn from the work of Arlie Verluis and Ellie Uytenbroek, which I probably pronounce not very well, two Dutch photographers. And if you go on their website, it's really interesting because they have a lot of series like this one, where they present this contrast between individuals who seek to have a strong personality, a look that affirms their individuality, but at the same time belonging to a group of people who share the same lifestyle and the same outlook also. And so the way we consume is also shaped by this need to belong to different social groups. So I'm coming to the last part of my presentation, so we can then discuss these ideas in the discussion at the end. The third part is about what are the alternatives. And here I wanted to discuss this idea that changing needs to take place at the same time at the individual level and at the collective level. And I think this resonates with what Oriane was saying in her talk in March, for those of you who have seen it. It's the idea that although I was saying that the kind of change we need to engage in is so big, that it's a huge challenge. I'm not saying that all the things that we can do at an individual level are not worthy of doing. They are very important to do, if only to experiment with alternative lifestyle on a daily basis, to discuss it within groups of people who are also trying to do the same, but also to discuss it with others who are not ready to make the change, and to show that these kind of changes are possible, not only possible, but are even desirable, that this alternative lifestyle might lead to higher well-being and to a very fruitful and satisfying life. And so it's very important to move from this low level of individual changes to changes within groups, within different settings, in the family, with friends, at work, to discuss these changes and to facilitate the transition also for others. But then again, this is not sufficient. And at some point needs to step in also the state and to bring in changes that would facilitate the transition towards alternative lifestyles. So to give you a few more concrete examples, first is this idea that it's very important to debate. And here I present the cover of a book by Francesca Polletta, who is a social movement scholar who worked on many social movements in the US. And in this book, she analyzes participatory democracy within these movements. And I very much like the title, Freedom is an Endless Meeting, because for all those who engaged in this participatory democracy, these processes are slow, they take time, and they also have other downside, because for outsiders, they might seem very complicated, people don't know the rules, they don't know how to intervene, so they might even be frightening for many people. So it's very important that this participatory democracy is practiced in many different contexts. And this is very much the idea of Carol Patman, a political theorist who worked on participatory democracy, who was one of the first to work on this idea. And her key idea is that it's very important that participatory democracy develops in different life spheres. She works on participatory democracy at the workplace, but it could be developed in schools, in the family, in civil society organizations, any place where it can be experimented, practiced, would lead to more people having the tools and skills to engage in participatory democracy. Then it's also the idea of changing practices, engaging in sharing, for instance. I have a book, I like it, you can have it, give it then to someone else, exchange it for something else that somebody has, and trying to move away from commercial relations, for instance, but also for this need to always consume new objects that maybe you will need only once. So finding alternatives to have access to the goods that you need on a daily basis, but not necessarily owning them and buying them only for yourselves. And this works in a number of fields, but again, it's really this experimental moment when you need to find ways to make it practical, convenient, available to large number of people. So it's really trial and error, I would say. And then the idea of engaging politically, moving to the streets, engaging in civil disobedience, signing petitions, whatever is available and corresponds to what people want and can do, is also needed to have these changes that do not stay only at the individual and or small group societal level, but that are able to really shape the society as a whole, and that can be also debated through democratic tools to make sure that we find agreements with majorities, if not more, of the citizens. And I think one element that is essential is the idea to experiment with, propose and promote alternative imaginaries. As I said in the beginning, the consumer society came about because it had this very strong narrative about equality. And the key selling message that was the message of reducing inequality, moving towards a more egalitarian societies. And when social change also needs this very strong narrative about where are we going, what is it that we are building, and something that is positive and would resonate with large segments of the population. And here, again, it's important to think about the three levels. So the individual level, the level of society and social changes, and the level of democracy. And I will only give a few examples that are drawn, but not only, from the idea of voluntary simplicity and degrowth and this kind of movement who are experimenting with alternative practices. So related to consuming less to live better is the appealing idea, I think, to work less and also to own less and to have more time to do other activities and to flourish, to develop the skills that everybody has, the activities that they enjoy and that they are good at. And I think this is something that would appeal to large segments of society, to be able to engage in more meaningful activities and to do things that they value and that they care for. And this comes along with with demands for social change. And one very important demand is the reduction of working time. If we work today 40 hours a week, is thanks to social movement, to workers, to trade unions who mobilized at the beginning of the 20th century to demand this reduction of working time. And when they demanded that, their demands seemed crazy. But today it's just normal to work that amount of time. Today we are in more individualized society where those who can afford to will reduce their working time. They earn enough, they can afford to work a little bit less, earn a little bit less, and have the time to do other things. But this does not benefit every member of society. And so therefore, it's very important to engage in these demands so that working time can be available, reduced working time, I mean, can be available to everyone, not just the wealthier segments of society. And then there are other social changes that could be supported by changes in regulation and by the state. Support for exchange networks. If you have a barter association, it will not bring about a lot of money. So how do you get a place in the city where you can store all these objects and facilitate the exchange between neighbors, between different social groups? Probably they cannot afford to pay for rents in downtown areas, so there the state could act as facilitator. And similarly, as I described, the city center that is dedicated to consumption, rethinking the cities for multiple usage, for to offer spaces that are able to satisfy multiple needs, not only the need to consume goods and services. And lastly, the need to engage in democratic renewal, to think about alternative goals than growth. Growth is something central in the program of most political parties, if not all of them. So this is something really that needs to be questioned and thinking about what could be the alternative goals of political parties, civil society organizations who want to engage in broad changes in society, and to redefine democracy and citizens' participation. How, when can citizens influence decision-making processes and have a stronger impact on the final outcome of democratic processes? And this is very difficult, of course, because those who are in political institutions are there thanks to the existing system and have the power that they have thanks to the existing system. So how to get to the point when they are ready to give up part of their power to transform democracy, to create new democratic institutions, such as a third chamber of randomly drawn citizens, citizens' assemblies, to think about specific laws. This, of course, for incumbents would mean they would have to give up part of their power. So how do you get to the point when they are ready to give up this power so that more citizens can contribute to shaping public policies and shaping our common future? And I think this is all I wanted to say about consumption and social change. And I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas with you. Thank you.